Other questions will be discussed at the end of the webinar. Now we are honored to be joined by Dr. Faiza Gaba. Currently, she is an obstetric and gynecology specialist, registrar, and honorary clinical lecturer based in Aberdeen, UK. She is also the founder of the Global Gynecological Oncology Surgical Outcomes Collaborative. Dr. Faiza will be discussing the impact of COVID-19 on training and mental well-being of surgical gynecological oncology trainees. Dr. Faiza, we're really excited for your talk. Please, can you join us?
Thank you, Aya. So it's such a pleasure to be talking to you all today from Aberdeen in Scotland. Just give me a moment to share my slides. And a big thank you to Dr. Alizam, as well as the Gynae Fellow faculty for the kind invitation. Slides. So let's just get going. So needless to say, back in March the 11th, 2020, the WHO declared COVID to be a global pandemic on the basis of the widespread disruption to healthcare systems worldwide. Whilst much effort has been invested in sort of evaluating the extent of disruption to different healthcare systems globally, the impact on gynecological oncology training explored. So what we did was devise a customized 81-item questionnaire, which we circulated electronically to gynecological oncology trainees via a variety of different international societies and networks. So we tapped into the resources of INIGO, which is the European Network of Young Gynecological Oncologists, which is closely affiliated to ESGO, the US SGO Oncology Network, as well as Gynecological Cancer Society. Our survey was also circulated via social media platforms such as Twitter and Facebook, and via a variety of social society newsletters. So in terms of how we developed our questionnaire, it was done in a systematic 4-step process. The first was a literature review, which generated a hard copy of the questionnaire. We held an initial consensus meeting, which consisted of 10 clinicians within gynecological oncology. 5 were consultants or attending gynae onc. Each member was asked to score each questionnaire item from 1 to 4. We then had a virtual follow-up consensus meeting with the same group of individuals, whereby we deleted low relevance items, optimized questionnaire length, and ensured readability. We finally then piloted the questionnaire across the world through a variety of networks to ensure that the online link was working appropriately. In terms of the content of the questionnaire, we incorporated 2 validated questionnaires that are widely used in the UK and the US, the Hamilton Anxiety and Depression Scale to measure anxiety and depression amongst trainees, as well as the Impact of Event Scale to measure distress. We also included questions on medical education, as well as changes in clinical practice and surgical exposure. In terms of our statistical analysis, we used the Wilcox ranked sum test and Fisher exact test to evaluate differences in means and proportions correspondingly. We built various statistical models to evaluate the effect of demographic variables and healthcare factors on mental well-being outcomes, and all our models were adjusted for a variety of demographics as well as postgraduate experience. So the aim of our study was threefold, essentially. It was to determine the impact of the pandemic on, number one, clinical practice across the world, medical education, as well as mental well-being. To be eligible to complete our survey, individuals had to be surgical gynecological oncology trainees. So in total, 127 individuals completed our survey. Approximately 50% were from countries with a structured national training program, and the other 50% from non-national training program countries. What do we mean by national training program? Well, we mean a curriculum which is accredited and regulated, which ensures standardized training across the country. So trainees that responded from NTP countries were from the US, Canada, Australia, the Netherlands, and the UK. So in total, 28% of all respondents had suspected or confirmed COVID. 28% experienced a drop in household income, and 20% were self-isolating from their households throughout the pandemic. We found that 62% of trainees had access to PPE some of the time, and interestingly, 45% had to reuse PPE and 22% had to purchase their own. 32% of trainees anticipated that they would require additional training time to complete their fellowship, and the additional training time anticipated did not statistically significantly differ between trainees from countries with or without a training program. So overall, we found that for 50% of trainees, surgical training was detrimentally impacted. We found a greater reduction in mean surgical exposure reported by non-national training program trainees. This table here, apologies, it is rather busy, but essentially it summarizes the mean reduction in surgical exposure for trainees according to surgical modality, as well as specific gynae-onc surgical procedures. And what sort of stands out predominantly is that regardless of whether trainees were from a national training program country or countries that don't have a national training program, access to minimal access surgery was more significantly affected in comparison to open surgical procedures. Encouragingly, departmental teaching continued for the majority throughout the pandemic, and a large proportion, 88% of trainees were regularly accessing e-learning resources. Now, the most commonly e-learning resources were ESGO, IGCS, BGCS, and SGO. Satisfaction with the online resources provided by these institutions was also very high amongst trainees. And we did find regional variance as to the types of trainees who were accessing these different resources. We found that countries that had their own national networks, such as the BGCS in the UK and SGO in the US, trainees from those countries were more likely to tap into their local training resources, as opposed to more international organizations such as ESGO, which is predominantly European, and IGCS, which has a more global following. We then developed linear regression models, which looked at the impact of a variety of factors, which you can see here listed in blue in this column, to see how they affected HADS score. So if you remember me saying HADS is the Hamilton Anxiety Depression Scale, something that we routinely use to measure anxiety and depression in hospitals throughout the UK. And essentially we found that trainees that had higher levels of income had lower levels of anxiety and depression, whereas the converse was true for trainees who experienced COVID-19 sickness. Those experienced higher levels of anxiety and depression in comparison to those who were not affected by COVID-19 sickness. This table here looks at a variety of variables and how they impacted on the on distress scores, which were measured by the impact of event scale, another validated questionnaire. We found that trainees from national training program countries experienced higher levels of distress in comparison to their counterparts from non-national training program countries. So this was a surprising and somewhat unexpected finding, which the underlying reasons are probably multifactorial and do warrant further investigation. Now, we have to bear in mind that based on these responses, the majority of, well, 92% of respondents from national training program countries came from the UK and US. And we know that both the UK and the US have been disproportionately affected by COVID in terms of morbidity and mortality for a variety of reasons. And that may have negatively contributed to higher levels of distress. In addition, our findings also showed that the overall workload was higher for trainees from national training program countries versus trainees from non-national training program countries, which may also have contributed to high levels of distress. We found that the majority of trainees from national training program countries were also having to reuse PPE. And we must bear in mind that our survey was circulated during predominantly the first wave and going into the second wave of COVID. So between sort of April 2020 all the way through to November, and sort of supply chain issues in terms of access to PPE have been widely reported in these countries. We found that trainees with adequate pastoral support had lower levels of distress. Mean mental well-being scores were measured via a customized linear scale, and we found that these scores were significantly higher pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic. So what are the implications of our findings to routine practice? Well, first of all, it was not surprising, but disappointing to learn that a large proportion of trainees were not getting access to PPE, and many were having to reuse it. And we find, a key finding is that employers and government agencies ought to be responsible to ensure adequate supplies of PPE, protecting healthcare workers optimally. In addition, there ought to be provisions for income protection, such as subsidized childcare, as well as access to subsidized accommodation for individuals requiring to self-isolate from their households. Training program directors, as well as educational societies, ought to be responsible for the continuing development of surgical skills. Throughout general surgical curriculums in the UK, simulation training forms a core part of a balanced curriculum. Within gynecological oncology, simulation training is less emphasized, however, would be of great value in situations where surgical opportunities are somewhat diminished, such as during the COVID pandemic. Virtual learning was widely accessed by a large proportion of trainees and was of high quality, and that was really great to see. Pastoral support ought to be regulated by codes of conduct, and training program directors and educational officers responsible for clear guidelines on how to access pastoral support when needed. However, the onus must remain on trainees to access support as and when required. So to conclude, I'd like to leave you with 3 takeaway messages. The COVID pandemic has negatively impacted surgical training and negatively impacted mental well-being of surgical gynecological oncology trainees. This isn't something that's just unique to the UK or the US, but something that we found across the board globally. We had 34 countries that completed, trainees from 34 countries across each continent that completed our survey. So it does seem to be a shared common finding. There are, however, ways to safeguard our surgical training by investing in simulation training. And we hope that lessons learned from the pandemic will incorporate surgical simulation training as part of balanced curriculums. Although these findings are very much specifically directed towards surgical gynae-onc trainees, published literature in other surgical fields from both the UK, Italy, Canada, and India all support our results that training has been detrimentally impacted, and in some scenarios and healthcare systems, reduced by up to 70%. Overall clinical impact did appear to be worse for trainees from countries that did not have a structured training program. However, interestingly, trainees from national training program countries did have experienced greater levels of distress. The recovery phase must focus on improving mental well-being along with addressing lost training opportunities. Our findings of cancer, if you'd like to learn more, please feel free to follow this, type in this reference and have a little read. Big thank you to all our collaborators, and thank you all very much for your attention, and I'd be very happy to take questions at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Faiza, for this insightful talk. Very important points to focus on, especially in this new changed world due to COVID-19.